Oh,
All
there
right.
you go.
Now,
Hey. Okay, let me set up my phone here. Hi, Menno, how are you? I'm so glad this finally happened.
yes. Salaam alaikum. What you say, right?
Alaikum salam. Exactly, you got it right. Is my voice clear? Everything is clear, or is it noisy, or do you need to change setup here and there?
Everything good?
Perfect, perfect. So, hi, Menno, how are you? How are you doing? Good morning. So for everyone, to give a brief introduction about you, this is Menno Henselmans, the scientific researcher, professor, doctor, everything. One of my role models, actually, and the author of the Science of Self-Control. I should say congratulations. I think you recently launched your audiobook. Am I correct?
Yes. Now I have the book available in paperback, hardcover, audiobook, and ebook.
That's very impressive. And also the personal trainer, the coach, who I'm currently studying with them, actually. We're in week 12 and there are so many material I'm going through. I'm trying to catch up. Actually, I think I'm one chapter behind, but the amount of information in the course is impressive.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's normal to fall back behind a week. It's a 9-month course, so at some point most people fall behind a little bit, and then they catch up during some of the case study weeks and everything.
Exactly. So let's kick off this interview by you introducing yourself. I'm not sure if I covered everything.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Menno Henselmans. I'm an exercise and nutrition scientist, writer about science. I make science more easily digestible to people. I'm also a coach myself, and I teach other people how to become coaches in my online certification programs.
That's very impressive. That's very impressive. I wish you all the best. So, as I spoke to you like a couple of weeks ago, why I'm doing this live session, recently there has been a lot of talk and confusion about the amount of protein that is optimal for an athlete. And one of your many research papers that surfaced is the one I shared with you with with Dr. Stuart Phillips. And basically the confusion happened because there is a recommendation within the paper that says the optimal amount of protein is 1.6 to 1.8, which you stand by. And I'm 100% convinced about this. I read everything you said about it, and I'm convinced about this amount. And I carry this amount in my daily meal plans. And there has been a talk that this is actually a recommendation for not athletic people or non-resistant training people. So what do you say to such talks about the optimal amount of protein for athletes or strength training athletes?
Yeah, that's not correct. The 1.6, which by the way is grams of protein per kilogram of total body weight per day, is specifically based on strength training individuals. Our analysis, our meta-analysis that we did, Morton et al., we only looked at strength training individuals. Now, many of them were untrained before the study, but then they were put in a strength training program, so they were doing strength training while they received protein supplementation, and then we determined, based on all of the studies together in that paper, basically we got the same conclusion as a lot of previous research, that at 1.6 gram per kilogram per day of protein per total body weight, there are no further benefits. So there are benefits up to until that point, and that's what we call that a breakpoint analysis. At that point, you're at the optimum level, so there are no further benefits. That's already for strength training individuals. Most research, I would say, for non-strength training individuals or sedentary individuals finds that the benefits cap at about 1.2 grams per kilogram of total body weight. And that's already a bit up from the traditional recommendation, which is 0.8 or 0.9 grams. That's still the RDA, I think, in America, for example. But some research finds benefits for satiety and body recomposition and health for up to 1.2. So it's 1.2 for optimum effects in sedentary, 1.6 for strength training. I recommend 1.8 as an additional safety margin based on research from Lemon et al. So that's already very, very extra safe. And in our analysis, we also looked at the effect of training status, but we did not have enough studies to directly compare protein requirements, but the trend was the same. So we found no evidence that the requirements differed. And in fact, there are a few studies that suggest protein requirements might decrease for strength-trained individuals. Because if you think, what determines your protein requirements? It's how much protein you need for total protein balance. Now, in strength training individuals, we know that there is less protein breakdown after training because their muscles are more resistant to damage. So they have lower rates of muscle protein breakdown after a given workout. In untrained individuals, when they have to build new muscle, they break the house down before they can build another, balcony. In trained individuals, it's like you're only going to build an extra chair on the balcony, maybe, so you don't have to break down the whole balcony. That's like how the body works, right? You need a certain amount of protein remodeling and breakdown before you can add additional contractile tissue. We also know that protein synthesis levels are lower in trained individuals because they don't build as much new muscle anymore. You don't build as much muscle, so you don't need as much protein anymore to build that. So if you look at that kind of research, it actually suggests, well, you need less protein synthesis and there's less protein breakdown. So logically, we could infer that protein requirements would actually decrease. Now, most research is done, or a lot of research is done on trained individuals, and it generally still finds about 1.6 is about the optimum. So I would not recommend going lower as you get more advanced. There's just very little need to, and research is not very conclusive that it's safe. But if anything, the research would err on the side of lower requirements. And some research on Tarnopolsky et al. In competitive bodybuilders, natural competitive bodybuilders, actually suggested indeed that protein requirements based on their protein balance, protein synthesis in particular, and protein breakdown, were only like 1.2 or 1.4, 1.5 at most. So yeah, if anything, actually the concern that these findings don't apply to more trained individuals, it's more the opposite.
Okay, so once you're going 1.8, you're not just being safe, you're being actually extra safe.
Yeah, you're being super, super safe.
It's like super safe, so there's no need to go above that amount. And one of the points you mentioned in the study, that even the people that were untrained, you put them to a training program within the study. So yes, you actually saw this and you benefited from it. Because interestingly enough, one of the comments I received is that this study, most of it, they weren't trained athletes. So they thought this could have affected the amounts of protein they needed. But that's a very good point you mentioned there regarding the trained and untrained athletes.
Yeah,
and,
it's also good to realize that we excluded people that did not train at least twice per week. So even the lowest volume studies, they train twice a week.
Oh, okay, that's a very interesting point. And also, if it's an elderly or young person, would you say that elderly people would need more protein requirements or less? Because one of the comments that they said that a lot of people in the study were elderly people.
Yes, we also performed an analysis to differentiate between young and old, and we found no significant difference in the effects of protein intake. Other than that, it was more difficult for older individuals to build muscle in the first place, just like it was more difficult for trained individuals. But it's independent of the effect of protein. It's just, if you're very old or you're very well trained, it's harder to build new muscle, whether you consume protein or not. There's also been a recent paper about this, a recent review paper, which specifically looked at the protein requirements and made a very strong case of the protein requirements of elderly individuals. And it made a very strong case that protein requirements of elderly individuals are the same as those of younger individuals. And that's in line with a lot of research that shows elderly individuals actually have a very large potential still to build muscle, especially if they're not already trained. It's their total their natty max decreases, especially if they're not on hormone replacement therapy. But if you get an untrained, sedentary elderly individual, even 70 years old, I think the largest study is one in people in their 90s. They still build actually the same amount of muscle on average as people in younger cohorts. The research on age is really strikingly in favor of still training when you're older.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Like a lot of people, I remember before even the study that said age does not affect your metabolic health. And people used to think that as soon as you cross 40 years old, you're done. Your metabolism just drops down and you lose all hope of building muscle or losing weight. But after that study, even now you're saying that even if you're 90 years old, you can still build muscle. That's very impressive. That's amazing.
Yeah, the big difference is the effects of age itself, which are very minimal up to at least 65 years old. generally, whether you look at hormonal health starts to decrease a bit earlier, but body recomposition effects, strength development, those kind of things, they don't really deteriorate as a result of age itself until you're about 65. However, most people actually start losing muscle mass already in their 20s, and that's not because they're old, it's because they're sedentary. So what's actually going on is that most people in our current society, when they're 20 years old, they graduate from college or they start doing a job, and they're sedentary. They don't do much anymore. They're not strength trainees. They don't have any hobbies. Actually, there's a big decline in people that have hobbies in the first place now. And as a result, they live a completely sedentary life. Their nutrition is not very good. They start slowly losing muscle mass. By the time they're 30, they've lost quite a bit. By the time they're 40, they lost some more. By the time they're 50, they lost some more. By the time they're 60, lost a lot more. So it goes gradually, and it's just at a certain point that people realize, like, oh, whoa, now I look really different. But that was actually the result of the past 20 years of being sedentary and not eating healthily.
Yeah, that's very true. That's right, very true. A lot of people, you have so many famous examples of people losing weight at a very, very old age. So it's not really an obstacle or somewhat a way to stop you from working out or getting in a better body shape. Mm-hmm. And there's one question I want to ask you regarding the protein requirements. So I read in the model of protein, there's a study that compared the 1.8 to 2.8 grams of protein, and it saw no difference. Mm-hmm. And this also proves your point of needing this. And they were also on resistant training athletes. So this also proves your point that 1.6 to 1.8 is more than enough. And I read the long article with Dr. Erik Hjelms. It was an amazing back and forth between you and Dr. Erik, and it was very impressive how the both of you have so much respect for each other that you kept this discussion about protein, and each one of you had a different point and completely different protein requirements. So mm-hmm. If you were to look into Erik's perspective, why would you say he is recommending higher amounts of protein?
I think our recommendations are closer in line now than they used to be. And they're not, wildly different. It's not factor 2 or something. Like, I'm generally at 1.8 for most individuals, and I think he goes up to 2.7 max. And in most cases, it's still more like 2.2 or even 1.8. I haven't talked to him in a while, so I don't know his exact current stance. But I do know it's generally over the last 10 years or so, it's gravitated down a lot closer to my recommendation. What you have to realize about the research is that it's not like we have a few studies. I did a quick count before this interview, and there are, I think, 80 to 100 studies on this. 80 to 100.
Wow.
Okay, that looked at different protein intakes and assessed body composition or strength differences. And Erik says, well, in a few of those, or let me put it this way, we can separate those between nutrient timing controlled and non-nutrient timing controlled. So in some of these studies, the only thing that differ between groups, assuming the study was done properly, is the protein intake. In none of those studies, which I think they're about 40, I'm pretty confident there are at least 30, none of them find any benefits, any statistically significant benefits of protein intakes above 1.6 compared to lower than 1.6. Many of them have looked up to 2.8, very high numbers. None. Now, in the non-nutrient timing controlled studies, which means in those studies often there's one group, for example, that has post-workout protein and the other does not, or not enough. In those studies there are, I think, 5 or so that do find benefits of higher protein intakes. But we cannot say, is it the higher protein intake or the fact that they had post-workout protein feeding? Because the other group did not. So, because we have the other 30, 40 studies not showing any effects, and in the other 40 or 50 studies, again, it's only 5 out of those that did find effects. It's most likely the result of, A, some people just not consuming enough, because even if you tell people, you have to consume 1.6 minimum, there will be some people in that study that consume less. And sometimes you look at the standard deviation of protein intake, you can actually see that their protein intake was 1.6 plus minus 0.5. That means that in the 1.6 group, there may have been individuals that did not even consume 1 gram per kilogram a day. So those individuals likely won't progress, right? So it makes perfect sense that there will be a few studies, like 5 out of 100, and not the best controlled studies, that do find a trend towards benefit. And Erik says, well, we want to be basically triple safe, and therefore, we may need more. And I think, Erik, also that those recommendations are mostly based on being an energy deficit, which is a bit of a different discussion. I think there's no difference between energy deficit and surplus, and a recent study found the same. But I think Erik still errs on the side of being, say, quadruple safe in energy deficit. And I'm very confident just being double safe.
And you also explained it perfectly how in an energy deficit, protein oxidation does not increase much. It's protein synthesis that drops by, I think, a little amount that's not very dramatic also. So technically speaking, you will need less protein in a deficit than in surplus.
Exactly. Theoretically, you would expect lower protein requirements because if you're in energy deficit, you don't build as much muscle. So yeah, you don't need as much protein as well.
And let's say the trends of the future studies to come, do you think that protein requirements are going towards 1.6, or we're still having up and down amounts of protein that's not like pointing at 1.8 to 1.6?
I think we'll gravitate just even more towards 1.6 because, like I said, this is one of the best studied areas in all of sports medicine, pretty much. I don't know any other topic. Maybe creatine supplementation. There's also a ridiculous amount of research on creatine supplementation. The protein requirements are extremely heavily studied. So we have research on bodybuilders, powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, sedentary individuals, military personnel, all sorts of athletes, gymnasts. So at some point, like if a study now would come out and say, oh, actually we do find benefits of more than 1.6, it would probably still not change my stance because there's a big chance for type 2 error or type 1 error. When you have 50 studies on the topic, they all say the same thing. One new study comes out and it says something different. You don't change your entire stance on the topic, right?
That's true.
You have to look at the total body of evidence, and that's now so solidly in favor of 1.8 being more than enough for the vast majority of individuals that I think this stance is unlikely to change to any significant extent within the next 100 years, probably.
And also it makes it easier. And protein, I think, eating carbs or fats is much easier than eating protein by a huge margin. And it's so much easier to consume carbs, especially carbs. So especially in a deficit, and saving those calories, let's say 200 calories you saved from reducing your protein requirements from from 2 point something to 1.8, you will save 200 calories you can put towards veggies or fruits or any high fiber content or high water content that will keep you full and keep you longer in your deficit. So you will adhere to the diet much longer.
And I think a lot of people that are very well trained and used to protein intakes of 2.2 or even more, they forget that for newer individuals, they actually find it difficult to consume that much protein. And it requires a very big change in their lifestyle. And for us now, we think if we're going to a theme park or whatever, and we have to eat, we always think like protein. How do I get my protein? If I'm going to a restaurant, well, okay, how do I get my protein, right? It's so well ingrained that we now think it's easy, but actually it's something that's always on our mind. So yeah, just having slightly lower protein requirements saves some money as well. And it also opens up the opportunity for protein sources like whole eggs and cheese to just make it a bit easier to use those as your protein, other than always having consumed meat or chicken, fish, etc.
That's true. That's true. And one of the most important points that completely changed my perspective from how I consume protein is the point that you mentioned in the course, that if your meal contains 50% high quality protein and the rest is, for let's say, plant-based or vegan source of protein, you can still count the whole meal as towards your protein intake, which blew my mind, honestly, because I always made sure I get, like, for example, 35 or 38 grams of protein from high quality protein specifically. And then whatever I get from plant source or vegan, I just completely ignore as if it doesn't exist.
Right. That's common. Actually, most research now, there is a lot of new research in vegan dieting because it's becoming very, very popular. Finds that the effects of vegan dieting are even less harmful than we thought. So most research on protein requirements is explicitly based on the assumption that 50% or only 50% of your protein intake comes from high quality sources. The rest you can fill up with any other kind of source. And if you consume a lot of broccoli or veggies in general, actually that can amount to quite some protein. So it just makes things a lot easier.
Well, that's true. And has there been studies that compared a completely high quality protein source to a mixture? Like, I think there was a study that compared whey protein to rice and pea mix, I think.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that was correct.
Yeah, there's been an explosion actually in this kind of research over the past 2 years. I think there have been like 8 papers on different types of protein sources, almost all of them with vegan or vegetarian comparisons. Insect protein is also newly researched and shown to be effective. In general, all the animal sources perform well in basically every single study. And the debate is how harmful are vegetarian sources or vegan diets. And the conclusion seems to be not so much, but I generally recommend higher intakes. You've seen the course recommendations. As a vegan, you have to determine, well, first you have to determine if you're lacto-ovo vegetarian or vegan. And the more vegan you are, the higher your protein requirements. And then it depends on what kind of protein supplements you use, because almost all vegans, I think, will have to use protein supplements. It's just very difficult to, well, you could consume tons and tons of soy every day, but most people don't want to, and you may have estrogenic effects, so not very practical. But yeah, for vegans, you want higher sources. But for anyone consuming at least 50% of their protein from high quality sources, 1.8 should be more than enough.
And I've seen a lot of people that whenever they try to implement a higher protein diet, they tend to go towards protein bars. A lot of them actually. What's your take on protein bars in general?
I'm not very fond of protein bars. I mean, in terms of protein quality, they're fine. Most of them, in fact, amount to basically a Mars bar with whey. So if you consume protein bars, you would get the same probably cardiometabolic effects as if you consumed a Mars bar with the same amount of calories and you chugged some whey protein shake. In fact, you'd be more the whey protein shake with the Mars bar probably than the protein bar. Most of the supplemental fiber is no bueno. It's not very effective. Most research finds that supplemental fibers don't have the same effects as the fibers when they're still bound in the food matrix. So they're not satiating, they don't have the digestive health benefits. In fact, a lot of people don't tolerate protein bars very effectively at all. If I eat a Quest bar, I get basically cramps. I feel like I'm about to give birth. It's really, really bad. Because they're loaded with FODMAPs, which are carbohydrates that ferment. So they're very hard to digest for a lot of people. Now, some are better than others. Some are just outright terrible. Some have some nutrients. You know, they have some nuts in them. But overall, I think the main issue for most people, the worst issue, is that they don't satiate. So let's say we're going to a theme park, like I said in the previous example, and you think, okay, how do I get my protein in? And you think, okay, well, I'm going to have my protein bars. They're portable, you know, great. You consume your protein bars, but they don't fill you. They're like tiny bars. You consume 2 of those, that's your protein. And if you're somewhat of a big guy or just a girl with a big appetite, that's not enough. And it's actually quite a lot of calories. One protein bar can have like 200 calories often. Mm-hmm. So you have consumed 400 calories and you consume two tiny bars of food. You're not full, you want more. So in terms of overeating, there's actually still a big risk that you end up overeating on other stuff. And I think you'd be much better off bringing, for example, some slices of smoked chicken breast with apples, for example. Way fewer calories, way more nutrients, way more filling, and still portable and easy.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Now, going back to the protein requirements, are there any special snowflakes that would benefit from higher intakes than 1.8?
It's possible. I mean, if there were enough of those, you would find those results in research. Like I said, right? If a significant percentage of a group actually had higher protein requirements, then that would screw up the average of the study, and we would find those benefits probably. But it's possible that there's the 1 in a million individuals that have insane protein requirements. There's just no way to tell. I think it's very unlikely. And if you were that kind of individual, it's likely that that would be an individual with very high potential for muscle growth. So sometimes I recommend higher protein intakes than 1.8 for, I think, 3 cases of individuals. One is people with muscle memory. If you had a lot of muscle mass before, you stop training, now you're going to train again, and you're going to do everything right from the start. And you're going to build muscle so fast, you're going to build muscle at rates that we don't see in research normally. So it's plausible that maybe 2.2 gram per kilogram, the sort of traditional bro wisdom, is okay then. If you're on steroids, anabolic androgenic steroids, I think 1.1 gram per pound, like 2.2 gram per kilogram, is also a good guideline, maybe even going up to 2.7. Because your rates of protein synthesis, again, are going to be way, way higher than natural trainees can achieve. And then there's maybe the individual that starts training and does everything right from the beginning, which is also extremely rare, right? As someone that has never trained before, you get them a good coach, and their nutrition, their sleep, their stress management, their training, they're going to hit the gym, not 1 or 2, 3 times a week, but no, 6 times a week, perfect nutrition right from day one. Maybe, yeah, probably 2.2 is still good, because again, they're going to grow so fast. That's not something we see in research. So basically, in some of these scenarios where we think we're going to see muscle growth rates that are beyond what we see in scientific research, maybe you need higher, but it's speculative. So, there's no research actually showing there are higher requirements.
And all these 3 cases you mentioned, they do make sense, because as you've said, the protein muscle synthesis will be much higher than a regular person who goes to the gym, like, for example, or an experienced lifter.
Yes,
and
on
the and on the same point, would you say that an advanced lifter requires less protein than a newbie or a beginner or an intermediate lifter?
I wouldn't decrease it. Like I said, theoretically, we might expect lower protein requirements, but since research doesn't conclusively show there are lower protein requirements, and a lot of the research is based on trained individuals, I wouldn't recommend anything lower. The more trained individuals, they also find it easier typically to consume that much protein. So I don't think it's going to make a difference. Only the cases, like I mentioned, a rank beginner, doing everything optimally from the start, maybe I'd push it to 2.2. But other than that, I wouldn't bother. Like 1.8 is a guideline that will probably apply to at least 99% of individuals, natural trainees at least.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm now more convinced about this than the beginning of the interview, because you made such good points, and all the points that you mentioned, they actually do make sense in theory and in actual research. So for everyone in the live, there's nothing to worry about. Don't go crazy amounts of protein. 1.6 to 1.8 is more than enough if you're wanting to make proper gains. And most likely going higher intakes of protein will take away from your carbs or from your fats. And a lot of people don't actually care that much for their fat intake. I've noticed from my followers and from a lot of people I know personally, they do not care for their fat intake. And in your model of fat, you recommend about 40% from your total energy expenditure to be from fat sources, which was mind-blowing for me. Honestly, I was one of them until I read that line in the chapter, and I completely switched my diet.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure you're a very busy man and you have a lot on your plate. Just to end it on a good note, so if there was one advice to give for new, advanced, or intermediate lifters who want to optimize their physiques, what would that advice be?
In terms of this discussion, I would say make sure you consume at least 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of total body weight per day. That's total protein intake, total body weight. There's no need to overcomplicate it, and you'll almost certainly be fine.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Thank you, Menno. Thank you so much for giving me this amount of time. I know I took a lot of your time, and you're a very busy guy. You have 1,000 things to do. Congratulations on your book, and congratulations on your success. I hope we can do this more often. We need a lot of your thoughts and your information, your knowledge here in the Middle East to change completely the bros out of the system.
Sure, yeah, I think we can do it. I've quite a lot of Arab followers now as well in the course. There are a lot of people from Arab countries. So I think it's a market that is now also has a lot more, how you say, is a lot more into evidence-based fitness. Because I think it's newer, and a lot of people seeing that it simply works. You know, this is what the evidence shows. It's not like theoretical stuff in a lab. These are simply the facts, and these will help you build the most muscle, build the most strength, lose the most fat. So it's the most efficient, optimal way to get the results you want.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Hope we can do this again.
All right, see you.
See you.